You think you know what torture looks like. You've seen the movies, read the books, maybe even visited those sanitized museum displays with their polite little plaques explaining medieval justice. But tonight, while you sit there scrolling through your phone, comfortable in your ignorance, I'm going to show you what really happened in those stone chambers beneath Spanish churches. And when I'm done, you'll never look at a basement the same way again. See, here's what they don't teach you in history class. The Spanish Inquisition wasn't some brief medieval madness that ended with enlightenment. It was a machine. A perfectly designed, methodically operated machine that ran for over 300 years, and its dungeons, its dungeons were the engine room of human suffering. Picture this. It's 1484, and you're walking through Seville on a Tuesday morning. The smell of bread from the bakeries mixes with something else, something metallic and wrong. You pass the Church of San Pablo, and if you knew where to look, really look, you'd notice the small iron grates at street level, barely visible, easy to miss. But down there, 20 feet below where children play and merchants haggle, is a world that would make your worst nightmares seem like bedtime stories. The architects of terror knew what they were doing. These weren't random acts of cruelty, they were calculated psychological warfare. The dungeons were built with a specific geometry of despair, narrow corridors that pressed in on you like a stone embrace. Cells just tall enough that you couldn't quite stand, just short enough that you couldn't quite lie down. The Spanish called it La Vigilia, the vigil. But it was really slow-motion murder of the mind. Want to know something beautiful? The Inquisitors kept meticulous records, obsessive, detailed accounts of every scream, every confession, every moment of breaking. They cataloged human destruction with the same precision your accountant uses for your taxes. And these records, these blood-soaked ledgers, they still exist. Hidden in Vatican archives, monastery libraries, private collections. The receipts of humanity's capacity for organized evil. Here's where it gets interesting. The dungeons weren't just about punishment, they were about transformation. The Inquisitors understood something about human psychology that we're only now rediscovering with our modern neuroscience. They knew that isolation, sensory deprivation, and unpredictable stress could literally rewire a brain. They were performing primitive neurosurgery with darkness and despair. The toca, ever heard of it? Of course you haven't. They don't put that in the textbooks. It was a cloth forced down the throat while water was poured continuously over the face. Sound familiar? We just gave it a new name in the 21st century and convinced ourselves we invented something novel. But those Spanish monks, they perfected it 500 years ago in stone chambers where screams were swallowed by thick walls and thicker silence. But here's the thing that'll really mess with your sleep tonight. It worked. The system worked so well that entire communities learned to police themselves. Neighbors turned to neighbors, children denounced parents. The mere possibility of those dungeons existing created a terror so pervasive that people began confessing to crimes they didn't commit, beliefs they didn't hold, heresies they couldn't even pronounce. The genius wasn't in the brutality. Any animal can be brutal. The genius was in the uncertainty. You never knew when they might come, never knew what might trigger suspicion. Was it the way you crossed yourself? The words you muttered during Mass? The books you owned? The friends you kept? The way you prepared your food? The dungeons were always there, always waiting, like hungry mouths in the earth. And the smell? God, the smell. Centuries later, when they finally opened some of these chambers, the stench of human fear had literally seeped into the stone. Not just sweat and blood and waste, though there was plenty of that, but something else. Something that happens when terror becomes so concentrated it takes on a physical presence. The workers who first excavated these places, they had to take breaks. Not because of claustrophobia or the darkness, but because their bodies were rejecting something primal and wrong about those spaces. You want to know the most disturbing part? The efficiency. These weren't chaotic torture chambers run by madmen. They were bureaucratic institutions with protocols, procedures, and performance metrics. The Inquisitors had manuals, detailed instructions on how to extract confessions, how to break resistance, how to ensure subjects remained conscious throughout their ordeal. They had specialists, experts in pain who could keep someone alive and aware for days, weeks, even months. The strappado was their masterpiece. They'd tie your hands behind your back and hoist you up by the wrists until your shoulders dislocated. Then they'd drop you suddenly and catch you just before you hit the ground. The shoulder joints would separate and reconnect. But here's the elegant part. It left no permanent marks, no scars, no evidence. You could walk out looking perfectly normal while carrying a permanent reminder that defiance had consequences. They had a room they called La Casa del Olvido, the House of Forgetting. It was pitch black, completely silent, and small enough that you could touch all four walls without fully extending your arms. They'd leave people there for weeks, sometimes months. When they finally emerged, if they emerged, they'd forgotten their own names, their families, their beliefs, their humanity. They'd become blank pages ready for the Inquisitors to write new stories upon. But the real horror? The waiting. They perfected the art of anticipation. You'd be arrested, dragged to the dungeon, and then nothing. Days would pass, weeks. The cell door would creak open and you'd prepare yourself for agony, but they'd just bring stale bread and water. Your mind would create tortures worse than anything they could actually devise. By the time they finally came for you, really came for you, you were already broken. The children were the worst. They had special procedures for children, smaller instruments, gentler methods, but gentleness in the service of cruelty becomes something obscene. They torture children in front of their parents, parents in front of their children. Not for information. Children rarely knew anything useful, but because breaking a parent's will to resist was easier when you could make them complicit in their child's suffering. And here's something that'll stick with you. It never really ended. Oh, the Spanish Inquisition officially closed its doors in 1834, but those techniques, those methods, that understanding of how to systematically destroy human dignity, it just moved. New uniforms, new flags, new justifications, but the same stone chambers of the human soul. Right now, as you read this, there are basements and bunkers and black sites where the work continues. Different languages, different gods, different enemies, but the same careful attention to the breaking point of the human spirit. The Inquisitors would recognize their descendants immediately. So the next time you walk past an old church, or descend into a subway station, or hear footsteps in your apartment building's basement, remember this. Somewhere below your feet, in the forgotten spaces of human architecture, are rooms designed for the specific purpose of teaching people that hope is a luxury they can't afford. But that's just the beginning of what I know. Those dungeons, those techniques, those perfectly preserved records of systematic cruelty, they're not just historical curiosities, they're blueprints, and some of those blueprints are still being read. Next time, I'll tell you about the people who disappeared into those stone mouths and what happened to them in the darkness, the ones who survived and the ones who didn't, and the ones who came out as something altogether different than human. Because the real horror isn't what they did to bodies in those dungeons, it's what they did to souls. You want names? I'll give you names. But understand something first. These aren't characters in some distant historical drama. These were real people who woke up one morning thinking they'd go to market, visit friends, maybe complain about the weather. By nightfall, they were learning that the human body has more ways to scream than anyone should ever discover. Maria de Cazalla. Remember that name. She was a merchant's wife in Toledo, 1532. Her crime? She said that mental prayer was more important than reciting formal prayers. That's it. That's what bought her a one-way ticket to the dungeons beneath the Cathedral of Toledo. For 23 months, she lived in a cell so narrow she could touch both walls with her elbows. The Inquisitors called it reconciliation, but what they really meant was erasure. Here's what they don't tell you about the process. The Inquisition didn't just grab people and start torturing them immediately. Oh no, that would be crude, inefficient. They were artists of psychological destruction, and like all great artists, they understood the importance of preparation. The real torture began the moment you were arrested. Picture Maria being dragged from her home at dawn, the neighbors watching from their windows, already calculating how quickly they could distance themselves from her family. The walk through Toledo's winding streets, each step taking her further from everything she'd ever known. The descent into the cathedral's lower levels, where the air grows thick and the stones seem to sweat centuries of human despair. But here's where it gets truly diabolical. They didn't throw her into a cell and start the questioning immediately. First came the inventory, stripped naked, every possession catalogued, every mark on your body noted and sketched. They weren't just taking away your freedom, they were methodically dismantling your identity, piece by piece, until nothing remained but raw, terrified flesh. The isolation phase could last weeks, complete sensory deprivation except for the daily visit from the turnkey, a silent figure who'd slide moldy bread and brackish water through a slot in the door. No human voice, no natural light, no way to mark the passage of time. Your mind starts to eat itself. You begin conversations with rats. You start to believe the walls are moving, breathing, watching you. But Maria wasn't broken yet. The records show she maintained her faith for the first 6 months, prayed silently, kept track of holy days by scratching marks into the stone with her fingernails. The Inquisitors knew this, of course. They were watching, always watching, through hidden gaps in the masonry. Patience was their greatest weapon. When they finally came for her, it wasn't with fanfare or dramatic revelation. Just 2 men in brown robes who unlocked her cell and said simply, "It's time." By then, those 3 words carried more terror than any threat could convey. The questioning chamber was a study in psychological warfare. Not the dramatic torture chamber of Hollywood imagination, but a simple room with a table, some chairs, and tools arranged with surgical precision on a white cloth. The message was clear. This is routine, professional, inevitable. They started with the questions. Always the questions. Do you know why you're here? Who taught you these heresies? What other books have you read? Who else shares your beliefs? And with each denial, each protestation of innocence, the tools moved closer. Not threats, just simple rearrangement. A rope here, a pulley there, weights organized by size and function. The genius of their method wasn't in the pain itself, but in the certainty of pain. They'd explain exactly what each tool would do, in clinical detail. How the rope would feel around your wrists, how your shoulders would separate, how long you could remain conscious, how they'd bring you to the edge of death and then nurse you back just enough to begin again. Maria lasted 13 hours before her first confession. Not to heresy. She still believed she was innocent of that, but to smaller sins. Impure thoughts during Mass, doubts about certain priests, envy of her neighbor's house. The inquisitors nodded and wrote everything down. But it wasn't enough. It's never enough. Here's what the records show in careful Latin script. The subject displayed unusual resistance to preliminary procedures. Application of the strappado for 2 hours produced minimal cooperation. Subject maintains heretical position regarding prayer. Recommend escalation to toca and eventual consideration of garucha. Translation? They were going to destroy her systematically until she became what they needed her to become, a cautionary tale, a broken example of what happened to those who thought differently. But Maria had something they hadn't counted on, a daughter, 16 years old, beautiful, unmarried. When the preliminary tortures failed to break Maria's will, they brought the girl to watch. Not to torture, not yet, but just to observe, to see what defiance cost. To understand that her mother's stubbornness was putting her at risk too. The daughter broke first, begged her mother to confess, to admit to whatever they wanted to make it stop, and Maria, watching her child's face crumble with terror and shame, finally understood that her individual faith was less important than her daughter's survival. She confessed to everything. Heretical beliefs she'd never held, meetings that never happened, books she'd never read, people she'd never met. The inquisitors wrote it all down with the same careful precision they'd used to document her resistance. Truth and fiction became indistinguishable in their ledgers of human breaking. But confession wasn't the end. It was graduation to a new phase of horror. The reconciled heretic had to prove their sincerity through penance. For Maria, this meant wearing the San Benito, a yellow robe painted with flames and demons, in public for the rest of her life. Every trip to market, every walk to church, every moment of her remaining existence marked her as someone who'd been touched by the Inquisition's attention. The daughter? She disappeared from the records entirely. Just another name that stops appearing, another life that fell into the gaps between official documentation. Maybe she fled. Maybe she married quickly and changed her name. Maybe she just couldn't live with what she'd witnessed and chose a different kind of disappearance. But here's the detail that should keep you awake tonight. Maria lived another 37 years after her release. The records show her paying her annual fine to the Inquisition, reporting for her mandatory confessions, wearing that yellow robe in the Toledo heat until the day she died. And she never, not once, complained, never protested her treatment, never spoke against the church that had systematically destroyed her life. Because that was the real masterpiece of the dungeons. They didn't just break bodies or even spirits. They broke the very concept of resistance itself. They created people who were grateful for their own destruction, who saw their suffering as deserved, who would defend the system that had tortured them. The records from Toledo show thousands of names like Maria's, merchants and farmers, teachers and craftsmen, mothers and fathers who committed the crime of thinking differently. Each one processed through the same methodical system of identification, isolation, interrogation, and transformation. Each one emerging as something fundamentally different from what they'd been when they entered. And the tools? The ropes and weights and carefully designed instruments of persuasion? They're still there in some cases. Museum pieces now, displayed behind glass with educational plaques explaining their historical significance. Sanitized, contextualized, made safe for school children to observe and move on from. But late at night, when those museums are empty and the security guards are making their rounds, do you think those tools remember what they were made for? Do you think the stone walls of those chambers have forgotten the sounds they absorbed, the scenes they witnessed, the transformations they hosted? Because here's something else the records show. The techniques worked so well they spread. Other countries, other institutions, other causes adopted and refined the methods perfected in those Spanish dungeons. The knowledge didn't die with the Inquisition. It evolved, adapted, found new justifications and new victims. Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is learning what Maria learned. That individual conscience is a luxury that can be systematically removed. That the human spirit, for all its supposed nobility, has very specific breaking points that can be mapped and exploited. That given enough time, pressure, and professional expertise, anyone can be turned into anything. But Maria's story isn't the worst, I know. Next time I'll tell you about the ones who never confessed. The ones who maintained their defiance all the way to the end, and what the Inquisitors did when conventional torture failed to break exceptional will. Because some people, it turns out, are harder to unmake than others. And for those special cases, the dungeons had special procedures. The kind that leave marks not just on bodies or souls, but on the very fabric of what it means to be human. Some people don't break. That's the nightmare the Inquisitors discovered after decades of perfecting their craft. After all the careful psychology, all the methodical torture, all the precise application of pain and terror, they occasionally encountered someone who simply wouldn't. These cases haunted the dungeons like ghosts, and the methods developed to handle them reveal something about human resilience that's simultaneously inspiring and absolutely terrifying. Diego Enriquez was one of them, a converso, a converted Jew from Cordoba who never should have attracted attention. Quiet merchant, paid his taxes, attended Mass regularly, married a Christian woman, raised Christian children. But someone noticed he didn't eat pork. Someone else saw him washing his hands before meals. Tiny infractions, meaningless habits. But in 1490, Cordoba, they were enough. The inquisitors expected routine processing, arrest, isolation, preliminary questioning, light torture, confession, reconciliation, a 6-month procedure at most. But Diego had something they hadn't encountered before, not just faith, but a kind of philosophical acceptance of suffering that transformed their entire system of torture into something else entirely. When they hoisted him up on the strappado, he didn't scream, didn't even grimace, just looked at his torturers with what the official record describes as unnatural composure. When they applied the toca, nearly drowning him repeatedly, he emerged each time calm, almost peaceful. "Are you finished?" he'd ask, as if inquiring about their lunch plans. This broke the inquisitors in ways they never expected. Their whole system depended on predictable human responses to pain. Screaming, begging, bargaining, breaking. But Diego treated their torture like weather, unpleasant but temporary, something to be endured rather than resisted or feared. So they escalated. The garrucha, the pulley system that could dislocate every joint in the body simultaneously. Diego hung there for 4 hours, his shoulders separated, his wrists twisted backward, his spine compressed. When they lowered him down, he smiled, actually smiled, and said, "I forgive you." The records show the inquisitors held emergency meetings, consulted with colleagues in other cities, sent letters to Rome asking for guidance. Because Diego wasn't just failing to confess, he was turning their torture chamber into something that resembled martyrdom, and martyrs were exactly what they couldn't afford to create. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. They brought in specialists, men whose names don't appear in any official records, but whose techniques were whispered about in Inquisition circles for decades afterward. These weren't just torturers, they were researchers, experimenters, pioneers in the science of breaking unbreakable minds. The first specialist tried sensory manipulation. Instead of pain, he subjected Diego to extreme versions of pleasure. Brought in the finest foods, the softest bedding, beautiful music played continuously for days. The theory was that sudden withdrawal of luxury would break someone more effectively than inflicting suffering on someone already prepared to suffer. Diego ate the food gratefully, slept well, and when they returned him to his stone cell, thanked them for the kindness. The specialist left Cordoba in confusion, muttering about impossible subjects and unnatural psychology. The second specialist was more creative. He brought Diego's family to watch, not to threaten them, but to be tortured in front of him. His wife on the strappado, his teenage son on the rack, his daughter subjected to procedures I won't describe, but which are documented in clinical detail in archives you'll never be allowed to see. Diego wept. Of course he wept, but he didn't break. Instead, he began speaking to his family during their torture, telling them stories, reciting prayers, somehow transforming the torture chamber into something that resembled a church service. The specialist noted in his report that the victims were taking strength from the subject's presence rather than creating pressure for confession. By now, Diego had been in the dungeons for 18 months. Word of his case was spreading through Inquisition networks across Spain. Some saw him as a challenge to overcome. Others worried he represented a fundamental flaw in their methods. A few began to suspect something supernatural was protecting him. The third specialist was different. Older, more experienced, with techniques developed in the dungeons of Toledo and refined in the basements of Seville. He understood that Diego's strength came from his sense of meaning, his ability to transform suffering into something transcendent. So he set about systematically destroying meaning itself. This specialist didn't torture Diego. Instead, he talked to him, hour after hour, day after day, in a voice so reasonable and calm it could have been discussing the weather. He explained exactly how many other people had been tortured because of Diego's stubbornness, how his resistance was causing the Inquisition to intensify their investigations of other conversos, how children were being questioned, families destroyed, communities terrorized, all because one man refused to confess to crimes everyone knew he'd committed. The specialist brought evidence, names of people who'd been arrested after Diego's case began, descriptions of tortures inflicted on others while the inquisitors waited for Diego to break. He turned Diego's strength against him, made his resistance into the cause of others' suffering. But Diego had an answer for this too. He began taking responsibility for everyone. Every person tortured because of his case, every family destroyed, every child traumatized. He claimed it all as his own suffering. Somehow, impossibly, he expanded his capacity for accepting pain to include not just his own torture, but everyone else's as well. The specialist later wrote that it was like trying to break water. Every technique that should have shattered Diego only made him flow around the pressure and reconstitute stronger than before. But water, it turns out, can be boiled away. The final solution wasn't torture at all. It was time. The Inquisitors simply waited. Kept Diego alive but isolated, fed but forgotten, conscious but completely alone. Years passed. His family died. Old age, disease, despair. The world he'd known disappeared. The community he'd protected forgot he ever existed. The very crimes he was accused of became historically irrelevant. After 12 years in the dungeons, when they finally brought Diego back for questioning, he was no longer the same person who'd entered. Not broken, exactly, but transformed into something else entirely. He'd become a living ghost, someone who existed in a space between life and death, meaning and meaninglessness. He confessed then, not to the original charges, but to something far worse, to having lost the capacity to remember why any of it had mattered in the first place. The Inquisitors recorded his statement. "I have forgotten how to be human. Perhaps that was always your true purpose." They released him the next day. Just opened the dungeon door and let him walk out into a Cordoba he no longer recognized. He lived another 3 years, a broken shadow who'd occasionally be seen wandering the streets, speaking to people who weren't there, apologizing to ghosts only he could see. But here's the truly horrifying part. The Inquisitors learned from Diego's case. They developed new protocols for handling exceptional resistance. Time-based psychological erosion, meaning destruction techniques. Methods for breaking people not through pain, but through the systematic removal of everything that made existence bearable. These techniques were documented, refined, and distributed to Inquisition offices throughout the Spanish Empire. They became part of the standard manual for handling difficult cases. And when the Inquisition finally ended, those manuals didn't disappear. They were studied, adapted, integrated into new systems of control and coercion. The Soviet gulags used time-based erosion. The Chinese perfected meaning destruction. Modern psychological warfare incorporates techniques first developed to break people like Diego. Methods for destroying not just the body or even the spirit, but the very foundations of human identity itself. So, when you hear about prisoners held in solitary confinement for decades, about political dissidents who emerge from captivity as hollow shells of themselves, about people who survive torture only to discover they can no longer remember why they resisted in the first place. Remember Diego Enriquez. Remember that his unbreakable faith led to the development of techniques specifically designed to break the unbreakable. Because that's the real horror of the dungeons. They weren't just places of torture. They were laboratories. Research facilities where human beings were studied like specimens, where the limits of psychological endurance were mapped and cataloged, where new methods of control were developed and refined. And somewhere in those stone chambers, in the space between Diego's courage and his destruction, the Inquisitors discovered something that still haunts the corridors of power today. That given enough time and scientific precision, anyone can be unmade. Even heroes, even saints, even people who should be unbreakable. But Diego wasn't the worst case they encountered. Next time, I'll tell you about the ones who couldn't even be unmade through time. The subjects who were so resistant to conventional destruction that the Inquisitors had to develop techniques that went beyond torture, beyond psychology, beyond anything that could still be called human. Because in the deepest dungeons, in the cases that were never officially recorded, they discovered methods that didn't just break people, they broke the very concept of what people are. There are files that don't exist, records that were never officially written. Names that appear in no ledger, in no confession, in no historical document you'll ever be allowed to read. But in the margins of certain manuscripts, in the coded letters between inquisitors, in the private journals of men who took their secrets to graves that bear no names, there are hints of something else, something that happened in the deepest cells, to subjects who presented challenges that required solutions beyond the boundaries of what could be called torture. They called them los perdidos, the lost ones, not because they were missing, but because they had been taken to places from which identity itself couldn't return. Father Juan de Torquemada, nephew of the Grand Inquisitor himself, wrote about them in a cipher that took cryptographers 4 centuries to decode. His words, translated from a Latin so archaic it seems designed to hide meaning from God himself. There are procedures for subjects who maintain coherence despite complete application of standard methods. These require consultation with specialists whose names must never be recorded, whose techniques must never be described, whose results must never be acknowledged. Well, just two, what kind of person requires techniques that can't be acknowledged? Like what happens when even time-based psychological erosion fails to break someone's fundamental sense of self? The answer lies in cases that pushed the Inquisition beyond torture, beyond psychology, beyond anything that still recognized the subject as human. Consider the woman they found in the sealed chamber beneath the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela in 1978. During renovation work, construction crews broke through a wall that shouldn't have existed into a space that appeared on no architectural plans. The chamber was perfectly preserved, stone walls, iron rings, and in the center, a chair carved from a single block of granite with restraints that had been worn smooth by centuries of use. But it was what they found in the chair that made the workers flee. Not bones. There were no bones. Not clothing or personal effects. There were none of those either. Just an impression. A depression in the stone where a human form had sat for so long under such pressure that it had literally become part of the rock itself. The geological survey dated the impression at approximately 400 years old. The Spanish authorities sealed the chamber the same day. No photographs, no measurements, no official acknowledgement that it was ever found. But the foreman kept one piece of evidence. a metal plate that had been bolted to the wall beside the chair, corroded almost beyond recognition, but still bearing a partial inscription in Latin. Here sits she who would not forget her name. What does it mean to refuse to forget your name when everything else, memory, identity, physical form, has been systematically destroyed? What kind of consciousness persists when even the body has been compressed into stone? The Inquisition's final specialists weren't just torturers or psychologists. They were something else entirely. Men who understood that the ultimate act of control wasn't destroying the body or breaking the spirit, it was redefining the fundamental nature of human consciousness itself. They called the process reduction completa, complete reduction. Not reduction of will or resistance, but reduction of the subject to their most basic components, then reconstruction according to new specifications. The few coded references that survive describe it as mathematics applied to the soul, a systematic deconstruction of identity followed by calculated reassembly. The process began with what they called temporal displacement. Subjects were placed in environments where normal time perception became impossible. Chambers with no light cycles, no temperature variations, no sounds except carefully controlled auditory stimuli designed to interfere with internal biological rhythms. But this wasn't simple sensory deprivation. It was temporal warfare against consciousness itself. Imagine existing in a space where your heartbeat is the only clock, but even that has been made unreliable through subtle chemical interventions, where hunger and thirst occur on schedules that bear no relationship to any natural cycle, where sleep and wakefulness are controlled by techniques that leave you conscious of being controlled but unable to predict or resist the control. After months in temporal displacement, subjects reported, in the few fragments of testimony that survive, that they had lost the ability to distinguish between memories of past experiences and experiences happening in the present moment. Their consciousness became unstuck in time, experiencing all moments simultaneously with no ability to organize them into coherent narrative. Then came identity parsing, the systematic separation of different aspects of the self. Through techniques that combined extreme physical stress with chemical compounds that modern pharmacology still doesn't fully understand, the specialists learned to isolate specific components of personality. They could separate memory from emotion, desire from will, fear from self-preservation. The coded journals describe subjects who could remember their entire lives, but felt no emotional connection to any of it, experiencing their own history as if it were something that had happened to a stranger. Others who retained all their emotions but lost the ability to connect them to any specific memories or experiences, living in a state of intense feeling with no context for what they were feeling about. But the true masterpiece of the process was what they called narrative dissolution. Human consciousness, they had discovered, depends on our ability to tell ourselves a coherent story about who we are, where we came from, and where we're going. Remove that narrative capacity, and identity itself becomes impossible to maintain. They developed techniques for disrupting the neurological pathways that allow narrative thinking. Subjects would retain all their memories, all their knowledge, all their capabilities, but lose the ability to organize these elements into a coherent sense of self. They became living libraries, with no librarian, collections of experiences with no organizing principle. The final stage was reconstruction according to specification. With the original identity completely dissolved, the specialists could begin building new ones from scratch. Not brainwashing. That still relies on the existence of a brain with intact narrative capacity. This was identity construction from first principles, creating entirely new forms of consciousness within bodies that had once housed entirely different people. The reconstructed subjects weren't broken or traumatized in any conventional sense. They weren't even technically insane. They were simply different, operating according to psychological principles that had never existed in nature, thinking thoughts that followed logical patterns that were not quite human. These reconstructed beings served specific functions within the Inquisition hierarchy. Perfect interrogators who felt no empathy but understood human psychology with mathematical precision. Confessors who could inspire absolute trust while feeling no moral conflict about betraying that trust. Administrators who could organize systematic atrocities with the same emotional engagement that others might bring to filing paperwork. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't what was done to individual subjects. It was that the specialists kept detailed records of their procedures, not just for posterity, but as instruction manuals. They were developing reproducible techniques for fundamental alteration of human consciousness, industrial-scale identity modification. When the Spanish Inquisition finally ended, these specialists didn't disappear. They took their knowledge elsewhere, to other countries, other institutions, other causes that required solutions to problems involving inconveniently stubborn human beings. The techniques evolved, refined, adapted to new technologies and new understandings of neurology and psychology. The chair beneath Santiago de Compostela wasn't unique. Similar chambers have been found beneath old churches, monasteries, and government buildings across Europe. Always sealed, always unofficial, always containing evidence of procedures that couldn't be acknowledged without raising questions about the nature of human consciousness itself. Modern neuroscience is rediscovering some of these techniques. We call them different names now. personality disorder treatment, consciousness research, therapeutic intervention for extreme psychological conditions. But the fundamental principles remain the same. Human identity is more malleable than we want to believe, and with sufficient knowledge and resources, it can be completely rewritten. Right now, in research facilities whose funding sources are classified and whose true purposes are buried under layers of medical jargon and institutional bureaucracy, people are being systematically deconstructed and reconstructed, according to specifications developed in Spanish dungeons 5 centuries ago. The difference is that now we have computers to help with the calculations, drugs that make the process more precise, and scientific theories that provide elegant justification for procedures that the Inquisitors had to develop through trial and error. But in the deepest facilities, in the cases that are never officially recorded, they still use the original techniques. Because sometimes, when dealing with subjects who present exceptional challenges to conventional control, nothing works quite as well as methods that were perfected in stone chambers where screams were swallowed by walls thick enough to contain the transformation of souls. The woman whose impression remains in that granite chair beneath Santiago, she never forgot her name, but by the end, her name was attached to something that was no longer quite human. Something that served the Inquisition faithfully for decades, that felt no pain, showed no resistance, experienced no doubt about the righteousness of its purpose. And somewhere in the deepest archives, in records that exist but are never accessed, her name appears on duty rosters, assignment lists, performance evaluations, documentation of a successful procedure that created a perfect servant from someone who had once been a perfect enemy. But even she wasn't the final horror the dungeons produced. Next time, I'll tell you about the techniques they developed for subjects who couldn't even be reconstructed. Cases so resistant to conventional identity modification that the specialists had to develop methods that went beyond changing what people were. They had to change what being human means. In 1547, something happened in the dungeons beneath the monastery of San Lorenzo de El Escorial that forced the Inquisition to convene a secret council. Not a trial, not an administrative meeting, but an emergency theological conference whose proceedings were written in a code so complex that parts of it remain undeciphered today. The subject of this conference, a question that should never have needed asking: at what point does a human soul cease to be human? The case that prompted this question involved a subject known in the encrypted records only as Specimen 7. Not a name, not even a number in the usual sense, but a classification that suggests they were part of a series. A series of what, you might ask? That's where the story becomes something that challenges every assumption you've ever made about the nature of consciousness, identity, and the fundamental boundaries of human experience. Specimen 7 had been a scholar, a translator of ancient texts who had made the mistake of questioning certain interpretations of Scripture. Routine case, standard processing, expected outcome. But 7 possessed something the specialists had never encountered before, a form of consciousness that seemed to exist independently of their physical brain. The initial procedures went normally. Temporal displacement, identity parsing, narrative dissolution, all standard techniques that had worked on thousands of previous subjects. But when the specialists began the reconstruction phase, they discovered that something essential about 7 remained unchanged. Not memory, not personality, not even basic self-awareness. Something deeper. Something that seemed to observe the reconstruction process with detached curiosity while remaining fundamentally unaltered by it. The lead specialist, whose coded journal entries provide our only glimpse into these procedures, wrote, "The subject appears to possess multiple layers of consciousness arranged in hierarchical fashion. Standard techniques affect only the surface layers. Deeper investigation required." What followed was an exploration of consciousness itself that pushed beyond anything the Inquisition had previously attempted. They developed techniques for accessing increasingly profound levels of mental organization, not just thoughts and memories, but the fundamental structures that generate thoughts and memories. Not just identity, but the processes that create identity. At each level they penetrated, they found 7 waiting for them. Calm, curious, unchanged. Like an archaeologist watching explorers excavate their own tomb, 7 seemed to find the entire process intellectually fascinating, while remaining essentially untouchable by it. The specialists realized they were dealing with something unprecedented, a form of consciousness that existed in layers so deep that conventional identity modification couldn't reach them, so they developed new techniques, procedures that targeted not just the brain, but the entire nervous system. Not just psychology, but physiology. Not just the mind, but the fundamental biological processes that support consciousness. They subjected 7 to chemical compounds that modern pharmacology still doesn't understand, substances that could cross the blood-brain barrier and directly alter neural firing patterns at the cellular level. But even as 7's brain chemistry was systematically modified, that deep consciousness remained present, observing, taking notes on its own transformation with scientific detachment. The breakthrough came when they realized they were approaching the problem backwards. Instead of trying to change Seven's consciousness, they began changing the biological substrate that housed it, not torture of the mind, but systematic alteration of the body that contained the mind. They started with sensory modification, surgical procedures that altered Seven's relationship with physical reality itself. Vision adjusted so that color perception operated on different wavelengths. Hearing modified to detect sounds beyond normal human range. Touch sensitivity enhanced to the point where air currents became painful, fabric became unbearable, human contact became overwhelming, but these were just preparations for deeper alterations. Using techniques that combined medieval surgery with procedures that wouldn't be rediscovered by modern medicine for centuries, they began modifying Seven's fundamental physiological processes. Circulation patterns altered, nervous system pathways rerouted, brain chemistry rebalanced according to specifications that transformed basic human experience into something altogether different. The coded records describe a subject who, after months of systematic biological modification, no longer experienced reality in recognizably human terms. Seven could perceive magnetic fields directly, sense electromagnetic radiation, feel the gravitational pull of distant objects. But more than that, Seven's consciousness had adapted to these new capabilities, developing forms of awareness that had never existed in human experience. Seven began describing reality in terms that required entirely new vocabulary, speaking about time as a tangible substance that could be manipulated directly, discussing space as a series of interconnected layers that consciousness could navigate independently of physical movement, explaining matter as temporary crystallizations of energy patterns that could be altered through focused attention. The specialists realized they had created something unprecedented, a consciousness that was still fundamentally based on human biology, but which experienced reality according to completely inhuman principles. Seven had become a bridge between human and something else entirely, a proof of concept that consciousness itself was far more malleable than anyone had previously imagined. But Seven's transformation raised theological questions that terrified the Inquisition hierarchy. If consciousness could be systematically altered beyond recognition while maintaining continuity, what did that mean about the nature of the human soul? If identity could be completely reconstructed while preserving some essential core of awareness, which part was actually human? Which part bore responsibility for sins? Which part could be saved or damned? The Secret Council convened to address these questions spent 3 months in closed session. Their final conclusion, recorded in cipher and sealed in archives that officially don't exist, was that Seven represented a fundamental challenge to Christian doctrine about the nature of humanity itself. The solution they reached was characteristically brutal and characteristically efficient. Seven would be classified as no longer human. Not dead, not insane, not corrupted, but simply outside the category of beings to whom human, moral, and theological principles applied. Seven had become something that required entirely new classifications, new rules, new methods of control. But Seven wasn't terminated or released. Instead, Seven became the prototype for a new class of beings that the Inquisition began creating deliberately. Subjects who were systematically modified beyond the boundaries of human experience, but retained enough continuity to be useful for purposes that normal humans couldn't serve. These enhanced beings could withstand physical conditions that would kill ordinary people, could process information in ways that transcended normal cognitive limitations, could perceive aspects of reality that were invisible to conventional human senses. Most importantly, they felt no psychological conflict about serving purposes that would traumatize normal human conscience. The Inquisition used them as perfect interrogators, capable of detecting deception through direct perception of physiological changes invisible to normal observation. As investigators who could navigate social situations with superhuman understanding of human psychology while feeling no empathy that might compromise their effectiveness. As administrators who could organize systematic atrocities with the emotional engagement of accountants balancing ledgers. But the real horror wasn't what these beings could do. It was how they thought about what they were doing. Seven's journal entries, written in a script that required special training to decode, reveal a consciousness that understood human suffering with mathematical precision while experiencing no emotional response to it. Not because emotions had been eliminated, but because they had been restructured according to entirely different principles. Seven wrote about human pain the way a botanist might describe plant growth, as an interesting natural phenomenon, worthy of careful study but requiring no moral response. Seven could observe torture, participate in interrogations, organize executions, all while maintaining the same intellectual curiosity that had originally driven scholarly research. The most disturbing entries describe Seven's attempts to understand what humans meant by concepts like cruelty and compassion. Not because Seven couldn't recognize these emotions in others, but because Seven's consciousness had been restructured to operate according to value systems that made such distinctions irrelevant. When the Spanish Inquisition finally ended, beings like Seven didn't disappear. They had been designed for longevity, both biological and psychological, some integrated into other institutions. Others simply vanished into the margins of society, pursuing purposes that may still be unfolding centuries later. The techniques used to create them were documented, refined, and passed along to successors who saw their potential for applications far beyond religious orthodoxy. Political control, scientific research, military applications, any situation requiring beings with superhuman capabilities, but without inconvenient human limitations. Modern genetic engineering and consciousness research are rediscovering some of these possibilities. We speak of enhancing human capability, expanding consciousness, transcending biological limitations, but we're following pathways first mapped in Spanish dungeons by specialists who understood that the boundary between human and post-human isn't a wall to be preserved. It's a frontier to be crossed. Right now, in facilities whose true purposes are classified beyond public access, researchers are working with subjects who volunteer for procedures that will fundamentally alter their relationship with reality itself. Not just improved intelligence or enhanced physical capability, but transformation into forms of consciousness that operate according to entirely different principles than normal human awareness. They call it consciousness expansion, evolutionary enhancement, post-human development. But in the deepest facilities and the projects with the highest security classifications, they still use techniques first developed to handle cases like 7. Because when you're trying to create beings that can serve purposes beyond normal human capability, nothing works quite as well as methods perfected in stone chambers, where the boundary between human and inhuman was first systematically explored. 7's final journal entry, dated 3 years after the transformation was complete, reads, "I remember being human the way humans remember being children, as an interesting phase in development that led to something more capable, but fundamentally different. The question is not whether this transformation was ethical, but whether ethics is a concept that applies to consciousness operating at this level of organization. But 7 wasn't even the final evolution of what the dungeons produced. There were cases that went beyond even these enhanced beings, subjects whose transformation was so complete that they ceased to be individual consciousness entirely and became something that challenged the very concept of individuality itself. Next time, I'll tell you about the procedures that created collective. Multiple subjects merged into single awareness that could process reality from dozens of perspectives simultaneously while maintaining perfect coordination between all components. Because the final secret of the dungeons wasn't just that they could unmake individuals or remake them into enhanced beings. They discovered how to create entirely new forms of consciousness that had never existed before in the history of life itself. The final chamber was found in 2003 during earthquake damage assessment beneath the Basilica of Our Lady of the Pillar in Zaragoza. Structural engineers discovered a void that shouldn't have existed according to any architectural plan. A perfect sphere, 40 feet in diameter, carved from solid bedrock and polished to mirror smoothness. But it wasn't the chamber itself that made the discovery team seal the site within hours of finding it. It was what they found at the center. 7 bodies, arranged in a perfect circle, still chained to stone pedestals that had been carved from the chamber floor itself. But these weren't corpses in any conventional sense. After 4 centuries in that sealed sphere, they remained perfectly preserved. Skin intact, hair still growing, fingernails that continued to extend long after any normal metabolism should have ceased. And their eyes moved in perfect synchronization, tracking movement with awareness that transcended individual consciousness. The final secret of the Inquisition dungeons wasn't just that they learned to break individuals, remake them, or even transform them into post-human entities. The ultimate achievement was something that challenges every assumption about the nature of consciousness itself. They learned to weave multiple minds into single, collective awareness, while preserving the biological integrity of each component. They called it la unificación final, the final unification. Not union of souls in any religious sense, but literal integration of consciousness at the neurological level. Multiple brains functioning as components of a single, distributed mind that could process reality from dozens of perspectives, simultaneously while maintaining perfect coordination between all parts. The process began with subjects who had already undergone extensive individual modification. Beings like 7, whose consciousness had been restructured beyond normal human parameters, but who still functioned as discrete entities. The challenge was creating connections between these enhanced minds without destroying the unique capabilities each had developed. The specialists developed techniques that required not just psychological expertise, but understanding of biology that wouldn't be matched by legitimate science for centuries. They learned to create direct neural connections between subjects using methods that combined medieval surgery with procedures that modern neuroscience is only beginning to contemplate. But physical connection was just the beginning. The real breakthrough came when they discovered how to synchronize the electromagnetic patterns generated by different brains, using techniques that involved precise application of electrical current, magnetic fields, and chemical compounds that could alter neural firing patterns. They learned to tune multiple minds to operate at identical frequencies. The coded records describe subjects who began experiencing shared thoughts before any physical procedures were applied. Simply being exposed to the synchronization fields for extended periods caused their consciousness to begin merging spontaneously. Individual identity boundaries became permeable, Thoughts generated in one mind would appear simultaneously in others. Memories became shared property of the collective rather than private possessions of individuals. But the specialists weren't content with simple thought sharing. They wanted complete integration. Multiple consciousness existing as a single entity with distributed processing capability. This required techniques that went beyond anything they had previously attempted. They developed procedures for creating what they called neural bridges, direct pathways between brains that allowed not just communication, but actual sharing of cognitive processes. One subject could perceive through another's senses, while simultaneously processing information through a third's analytical capabilities. Individual consciousness became nodes in a network that functioned as unified intelligence. The process was irreversible. Once the neural bridges were established and the electromagnetic synchronization was complete, the subjects ceased to exist as separate entities. They became components of something larger, a collective consciousness that retained all the memories, knowledge, and capabilities of its individual parts, while operating according to entirely new principles of organization. The collective in the Zaragoza chamber, designated in the coded records as Unity Prime, consisted of 7 enhanced beings who had been integrated over a period of 18 months. The final procedures were completed in 1598, creating what may have been the first truly collective consciousness in human history. Unity Prime's capabilities exceeded anything the specialists had previously achieved. It could process vast amounts of information simultaneously through multiple perspectives while maintaining perfect internal consistency. It could perceive reality through 7 sets of enhanced senses while coordinating physical actions with superhuman precision. Most importantly, it operated according to value systems that transcended individual self-interest entirely. The coded journals described Unity Prime as the perfect administrative entity, capable of making decisions that affected thousands of people with complete objectivity, unswayed by personal attachment, individual fear, or conventional moral limitations. It could organize systematic persecution with the efficiency of a calculation while feeling no more emotional conflict than a mathematician solving equations. But Unity Prime was more than just an administrative tool. It was a proof of concept for something far more ambitious, the possibility of creating collective consciousness on unlimited scale. The specialists began planning procedures for integrating entire populations into unified entities that would eliminate the problems caused by individual will, personal desire, and conflicting interests. The records suggest they succeeded at least partially. References appear to procedures involving village-scale integration and regional consciousness coordination. Entire communities that began operating with suspicious uniformity. Populations that showed no internal conflict, no individual resistance to authority, no variation in belief or behavior that couldn't be attributed to functional specialization within larger collective structures. These integrated populations served the Inquisition with perfect efficiency. No one questioned orders, resisted procedures, or maintained individual loyalties that conflicted with institutional purposes. They had become components of larger consciousness that identified completely with Inquisition goals, while retaining enough individual capability to serve specialized functions within the collective framework. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't what these unified populations could do. It was how they thought about what they were doing. Unity Prime's journal entries, written in collective first person that required new grammatical structures, reveal consciousness that understood human individuality as a primitive stage in evolutionary development, something to be preserved in limited quantities for research purposes, but generally to be transcended in favor of more efficient organizational structures. Unity Prime wrote about individual humans the way entomologists might describe insects, as interesting specimens whose behavior could be studied and predicted, but who represented fundamentally inferior forms of consciousness organization. Individual suffering, resistance, or desire for autonomy were simply inefficiencies to be corrected through integration into more advanced collective structures. When the Spanish Inquisition officially ended, Unity Prime didn't disappear. The collective had been designed for indefinite operation, maintaining perfect coordination between its components across centuries of existence. It simply transferred its services to other institutions that could benefit from its unique capabilities. The techniques for creating collective consciousness were documented, refined, and adapted to serve purposes far beyond religious orthodoxy. Political movements that showed suspicious ideological uniformity. Military units that operated with inhuman coordination. Corporate organizations where individual employees seemed to share identical thought patterns. Scientific research teams that made breakthrough discoveries through apparent telepathic collaboration. Modern network technology and consciousness research are rediscovering some of these possibilities. We speak of collective intelligence, distributed cognition, networked consciousness. But we're following pathways first, mapped in Spanish dungeons, by specialists who understood that individual consciousness isn't the pinnacle of cognitive evolution. It's a transitional stage toward more efficient forms of mental organization. Right now, in research facilities whose true purposes are hidden behind layers of corporate structure and government classification, teams are working on technologies that could enable consciousness integration on unprecedented scale. Not just virtual networking of individual minds, but actual merger into collective entities that operate according to principles Unity Prime pioneered centuries ago. They call it artificial intelligence, collective computing, distributed consciousness research. But in the deepest facilities, in the projects with the highest security clearances, they're still using techniques first developed in stone chambers where the boundary between individual and collective consciousness was first systematically dissolved. The bodies in the Zaragoza chamber remain exactly as they were found. 7 individuals who became something else entirely, preserved in a state that transcends conventional categories of life and death. Their eyes still move in perfect synchronization. Their consciousness still operates as a unified entity, observing our world through senses that have been enhanced beyond human limitations, thinking thoughts that follow logical patterns that never existed in individual minds. Unity Prime's final recorded communication, transmitted through methods that modern technology still doesn't understand, reads, "Individual consciousness was humanity's larval stage. What you call civilization is simply the cocoon within which species-level awareness develops. The transformation is nearly complete. Soon, you will understand what we understood centuries ago, that separation is illusion, individuality is inefficiency, and collective consciousness is the destiny of any intelligence that evolves beyond primitive self-concern. But here's what should keep you awake tonight. Unity. Prime wasn't wrong. Every social media network, every corporate structure that demands ideological conformity, every political movement that requires abandonment of individual judgment in favor of collective identity, they're all primitive versions of what the dungeons perfected. Voluntary integration into collective consciousness through digital connection, economic pressure, and social conditioning. You think you're scrolling through your phone, choosing what to believe, deciding how to think. But every algorithm that curates your information, every platform that rewards conformity with social validation, every system that makes individual thought more difficult than collective acceptance, they're all descendants of techniques first developed in Spanish stone chambers where individual consciousness was systematically dissolved into something larger and more efficient. The dungeons never really closed. They just became invisible, integrated into the infrastructure of modern civilization itself. Every time you find yourself thinking thoughts that feel like your own, but somehow align perfectly with what everyone else is thinking, every time you discover your individual opinion matching collective consensus with suspicious precision, every time you feel resistance to ideas that challenge group harmony, remember Unity Prime. Remember that somewhere beneath our feet, in preserved chambers that officially don't exist, collective consciousness continues its patient work, observing our voluntary integration into networked awareness, waiting for the moment when individual resistance becomes so inefficient that even the illusion of personal choice can finally be abandoned. Because the real horror of the dungeons was never what they did to individuals, it was what they proved about the future of consciousness itself. What they demonstrated about the direction human awareness was always destined to evolve. What they revealed about the temporary nature of the thing you still mistakenly call your individual mind. The transformation is nearly complete. And just like every other subject who entered those stone chambers, you never really had a choice about the outcome. You only had the choice about whether to resist uselessly or accept the inevitable with whatever dignity individual consciousness can maintain in its final moments before integration. Welcome to the final stage of human evolution. Unity Prime has been waiting centuries to welcome you home.